Hi there, this is Carl Irwin, the Common Magician, with another video on this little series we're doing concerning basic controls, basic table controls. We looked first at the top stock retention riffle shuffle, very simple, and a couple of ways that you can hide that very obvious control and make it considerably less apparent. And then we also looked at just a few table cuts, false table cuts that are very deceptive. And if you put these things together, very simple top stock retention, simple table cuts, you actually have a fairly robust sequence of shuffling that can be used for a variety of different types of magic, particularly useful in gambling type routines. One thing about that, and what we're going to talk about today is going to be the stock itself, the size of it, how you want to use it, the thinking that you should put into it, or that you might want to put into it. Really, you can do anything you want. There's no rules about any of this stuff. You can do what you want. It's your magic, right? But we're going to talk about the stock itself, and then we're going to talk about a second tier of deception, which can be very helpful, particularly in any kind of magic, but particularly with magic as opposed to gambling type routines, because those are very different kinds of magic demonstrations, mostly among magicians. Let's talk about that very briefly. Magicians often will differentiate between gambling routines and magic, card magic. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's a bit of a snobbery kind of too. It's not useless snobbery. I mean, there's certainly things to be said about the differences between the two. But I think in general, the public, again, when we're talking about the lay spectator, we're talking about everybody, right? There's not like this small category of the lay spectator and then magicians, which, it's not even close to 50%. Magicians really make up 8% or less. And then everything else, the 99 plus, is everybody else, right? Those people, everybody, they don't see the difference between the two. David at Magic Orthodoxy recently put up a video talking about the most powerful effects. And he said he was going to list the top 10 most powerful effects according to magicians that they perceive in their performances. And when he did that, I said out loud to myself, I said, number one's going to be some kind of gambling routine. And because he said it was going to be surprising, and I knew that would be the surprising thing, but I also know from my experience that that's the stuff that really hits home better. You could do an interesting gaffed card, weird kind of card warpy sort of strange otherworldly magic trick with apparatus, that really enhances it, or a levitation or something like that. And honestly, the gambling routine hits harder, in my experience, for the first reason, in that I think there's an honesty. It's strange, but there's an honesty in doing the gambling routine. People assume, right or wrong, usually wrong, that there is an enormous amount of skill going into it, and that's impressive, right? They presume that it's fair, and it also is something that relates. They know what it is. People don't have to gamble. They don't have to ever play any card games to know that aces are important. They don't have to play card games to know that a royal flush and its makeup, what it is, and that it is important. Whenever you're doing gambling routines, you're latching onto these attributes, these common knowledge items, concepts, and you're portraying them in under the context of control, card control. That is highly impressive to people, very impressive. And as we're looking at this, what I've shown you up to this point is really all you need to do those kinds of tricks, and they can hit pretty hard. What we're going to talk about is kind of a second level deception here in a moment that can kind of get you more into the magical side of it. I would also incorporate a lot of things that magicians consider to be card magic and not gambling routines. I would reclassify them more as gambling oriented, if they focus on high value. So you could do an ace assembly, right? Or cutting the aces, spectator cuts the aces, those kinds of things. Those really are gambling routines. They really are, because they're dealing with the high value. And that's what spectators perceive about those effects. You could do, assembling the twos. It's the same trick, but it's the fact that you use the aces that actually has a subconscious, um, not even really subconscious. It is more overt. It's got a value assigned to it, right? It's kind of like doing cups and balls with, plastic cups versus doing cups and balls with some kind of antiqued brass apparatus, right? It's got a level of prestige associated with it if you're using high value cards, and people think about that in the realm of gambling. Okay, so even something like an ambitious card routine, people look at that as a card control feat. Right? We magicians like to think about the magic, but I'll be honest with you, most of the people I perform for, they think magic, don't waste my time. This is kid stuff. Don't do the snappy, don't give me stories about how cards are moving and all this. They know full well what's going on. They just don't know what is going on, and that is what is impressive. One quick analogy on this. I am a musician. There can be aesthetic experiences with music that deal with the emotion, the non-propositional truth, right? The portrayal of an idea that hits here, right? And that can be classified as good music. Film score tries to do that a lot, right? Movie music, TV music. That's what they try to do, enhance the drama with the music, right? However, music can be highly technical and be just as aesthetically pleasing or more, right? You can see a performer come out and do something extremely complex and apparently difficult, and that has an aesthetic quality to it, a satisfying quality to it that is impressive and entertaining. Okay? And I argue that tends to matter more to people than the other stuff. It's harder to get to the other stuff. It certainly is easier in a way to just do something difficult and get recognized for it. Apart from doing something difficult is difficult in and of itself. But doing something that is technical is very, very impressive. It is aesthetically pleasing. It is a magical moment in and of itself. Case in point, talent shows work on this premise, right? When you watch America's Got Talent or Britain's Got Talent or one of these, Australia's Got all these different offshoots of that idea, or The Voice, right? In these singing competitions and the dance competitions. What really hits people is the complexity and difficulty of things. If something is very difficult and obviously very complex and well rehearsed, that gets the points. That gets the point value as far as people are concerned. That's the aesthetic charm to it. Don't be fooled. That's where it is with this too. And man, you know what hits that mark? Gambling routines. That's a fact. That's a fact. So even though we may find them boring, we may find them dull, we may not like it, the fact of the matter is that those card demonstrations that focus on gambling and card control, those tend to be really, really well received. And people often look at the magic stuff really as the offshoot of the card control, right? I'm doing ambitious card. They don't think of it as a magical moment. They really don't. They're not, give your audiences credit. Okay, they're adults. They're if you're performing for adults, they're intelligent people. They know it's a trick. They do. Okay, they perceive it as skill. You can do and then it moves to the top. You can do that stuff, but if you really lay into that, they feel insulted. That's my experience, right? So anyway, card control. That's really how people look at it. So gambling routines. Good stuff, and this fits right into that. You could do what we've talked about here, do a gambling routine, and that's it. So, quick review. We talked about card control, just reversing the top and bottom stocks. We talked about some of these false cut variations, right? False strips. We talked about the double undercut, and then the what looks like a fair table cut, right? Transitioning the break. And that brings us to this point. This looks like a fair shuffling sequence right before a card game. And from here, you could do a gambling type routine straight out. And this could be the effect, right? Or a piece of the effect. All right, so now let's talk about what's going on here. What I've chosen to do is I've only dealt out the pocket cards and I ended right there. If this was Texas Hold'em, and we'll talk about Texas Hold'em here in a moment. If this was Texas Hold'em, I would put out a sequence of 5 community cards, and that doesn't really add a lot to the stack. Right now I only have 8 cards, plus the 5 that be out there would be a pretty small slug, but about as big as you want it to be. Texas Hold'em as a game, which is a very popular game in the United States, less popular elsewhere, is a better format to do gambling demonstrations using slug retention than some of the older, more traditional games like draw poker, where you would have to deal out 5 cards for each player. Right? If you were doing a Texas Hold'em demonstration, you could eliminate even 2 hands here. That gets 8 cards out of the way, 5 community cards and just 4. It's a small slug. So keep that in mind. Number 1, you want to keep your slug manageable. The smaller the slug, the more deceptive the sequence when you're doing what we're talking about here, okay? So you can put together a good gambling demonstration using only the controls we talked about, a slug that does only whole cards, right? Just a player's hand, right? Or you could add in the community cards as well, using the premise of the game and the platform of that type of game. You have a small slug, and then you've got yourself about 6, 7, maybe 10 minutes with the interaction of a gambling demonstration with a pretty big payoff at the end, right? And that's without getting into allowing them to make choices on who gets the hand or whatever. Just straight up dealing out a hand that's been retained. Another thing about this, when you're doing gambling demonstrations, it helps if you muddle the premise of the demonstration, right? When I say muddle the premise really, the underlying premise is that we're just controlling a slug. But if you talk about stacking, and if you talk about bottom dealing or second dealing, if you talk about these ideas, right, in your setup, you then portray that you're doing these things when in fact you're doing something much more simple. And this gets into what I was referring to with gambling demonstrations and the magical impact, the aesthetic impact that they can have. People think about this as being complicated and complex and difficult. If you can talk about and anchor the spectator's mind, calibrate their perception into these very difficult or perceived as difficult maneuvers, bottom dealing, second dealing, stacking, riffle stacking, right? Talk about these ideas. When you do your demonstration, that's what's in their mind, right? Especially as you're going through and you say, and then this is the point where the gambler would stack the right? You could do that. You could talk about things in that kind of frame. So it might look like this, right? You could, another false cut there, triple cut. You swing cut off one, swing cut off another, and you're just keeping big wide breaks here. And then you take the third packet, drop it to the table, and then you put the packets back. So in your talking, you say, gamblers have to control all of the cards at the game when they're at the table. So when the cards would come for them to deal, what they would do is they would engage in riffle stacking. That is the time when they are taking cards that are known in known locations and then riffling them into the place that they want them to be. Then the next thing that they would do is they would want to try to organize the cards while apparently dealing or shuffling fairly. They would want to get them to the bottom of the deck, even if another player cuts the cards fairly, as you see here. they would want to reorganize the cards to the bottom so that they could deal the favored hand to themselves. And then at the end of play, they end up with the pocket aces, right? This is a demonstration of card control, and I'm talking about concepts that have absolutely nothing to do with what I'm doing. Okay, so that's very useful. So, one, keep your slugs small and manageable by thinking about the context of what you're doing. What kind of game are you demonstrating? Here we're just looking at the whole cards. We're just looking at the pocket cards, right? And that's enough to do the demonstration. Second, we're talking about the pattern that we're using that implies skill levels that we don't have to actually employ. We're working with just the retention of a slug, but we're talking about other areas of control that heighten the suggestion of complexity, right? And then that in itself, it increases the aesthetic pleasure of the demonstration. People walk away from this thinking this was very difficult, this was impressive, and therefore I am satisfied at an entertainment level. I've been entertained. Okay. All right. Now, we were looking at just a small slug in the original thing with some numbers that spelled out shell. Okay. Now this gets to the a second area that we're going to talk about. First being the slug. The second one being a secondary moment of choice. Secondary moment of choice, a secondary level of deception that brings the spectator in on the action. This is very useful when dealing with magical effects as opposed to gambling demonstrations. Gambling demonstrations, you can do everything yourself. You don't need them to participate. But if you're going to do a magical effect, it can be helpful to add the perception that they've made a selection. And this is very simple to do. I have my slug on top. I've got the cards that I need to get to. I need to get the spectator to get to them. So in the example of the shell trick, what I did was very simple. I said, please cut the cards about halfway. And then I proceeded with a cross-cut force, right? And I go on, I talk about something, I come back to this, and you cut here. And then I deal out the cards that I need. So what I've done is I've added a layer of deception to my stock retention. And I've buried the stock retention. The stock retention becomes fairly irrelevant, even though it was incredibly essential. One, it demonstrated that the cards were fairly mixed. Two, they weren't. It allowed me to get to this point. And now I have a secondary level of deception where they think they're picking a random spot when in fact I'm forcing them into it. It doesn't even have to be this complicated. It could be a simple cut and then do a riffle for us. Can you tell me when to stop right there? Would you like to stop there or go further? That's it? Okay, go ahead. We'll take off these cards right here, right? And then you force out what you have. Other possibilities, if you have, I've lost my stock, you have your stock on the top. You could, this is one I've done before, you could say, go ahead and somewhere in the middle, just take out any card. They reach out, they take out a card, and what you do is you separate the stack. You say, it's not important, you can go ahead and turn it over just to see where you're at. And then what I've done is I've set up my crisscross force. What I did is I brought together the packs, but I set the pack at the break on top of the other one, right? I could say, does this mean anything to you? Talk about this, whatever, go on with this. I don't even have to acknowledge what it is because it's really just a break. I could say, what we're really interested in is where you broke off here. You broke off at this point very freely, right? You could have picked any other spot. So there's ways to ring in the discrepancy of the top to the bottom using that kind of displacement. Okay. Another very favored way of doing that exact same idea is to have someone take a card out of the middle. As they look at the card, you reverse the spread. So this is a reverse spread displacement. And you could say, go ahead and turn it over and place it back in. You can see this is where our break is at. We're at this spot here, and then you can deal off. And you've actually displaced the top to the bottom. So any kind of force where you're forcing them into that top section is a second level layer of deception that can magnify the trick because it brings in their free choice and it buries the control that was done ahead of time. In the next video, we're going to talk about how we can take some of these concepts and get them off the table. A lot of people really prefer to do their magic in the hands, walk around. They don't always have a situation where they're sitting down where they have a good surface to do their controls at. And we'll look at how we can adapt some of this stuff in the next video to in the hands. But anyway, we have top stock retention riffle. Simple, extremely simple control, very little preparation and practice on that, very little maintenance that you need to do. You really just need to practice the fluidity at which you do it, right? A few false cuts, false strips, some simple concepts there as far as making our control look like a fair sequence as if you were in a game, in a card game. We talked about the slug, how big it should be, thinking about the context of your effect and trying to keep your slug small in the demonstration. We talked about also the nature of gambling routines and how you can do a gambling routine, talking about other controls, heightening the aesthetic experience by leaning in on the perception of difficulty. And then we talked about also a secondary level of deception by bringing in the spectator in what appears to be a free choice, but really just a force, applying any kind of force that you know that gets them into that top slug, and then working from there. From here, we'll go on to in the hands alterations to do some of these things in the hands. And then we'll end up probably in the last video, we'll be talking about revelation ideas, how you can really pay off simple controls much, much bigger by thinking about and considering your revelations and some of the details that can go into that, and even making some fairly impressive things out of impromptu moments. So that's where we'll go next. Anyway, that's what I got for you today. Good luck with that. Happy magicking.